Yeah, hello. Thank you very much. I'm Max von Grafenstein. I'm a lawyer, professor, and researcher in the area of data governance. I'm also working here for the new Hanse project and the city of Hamburg and the new institute, which is a great honor. So I would like to give you a brief overview about the initial findings of our project of the Urban Data Challenge and the blueprint. And I took for that the provocative title. So, does a universal data sharing law solve the value for risk dilemma in data sharing? So, and if we hear a universal data sharing law, wow, this is a huge data sharing law because it really covers everything. Everybody gets data from everybody. And I took that title because it's a little bit an intellectual provocation, in particular if you come from a more liberal perspective. But as you will see, after we will have taken some conceptual steps of thinking, it's not so provocative anymore, and we will come to a certain conclusion, also with respect to our issue here. So let's start with our interims conclusion. And there with the main challenges we found also in previous projects before, because when we talk about data sharing, the main challenge, the first challenge is always that we, at least in Europe, we have a highly regulated market. And when you start sharing data, there are many, many different applicable laws, sometimes conflicting each other. And this is what you have to handle with. And this becomes even a little bit more complex because with respect to these laws, it's not only applying a law on paper and then that's it, but you have really to synchronize your technological and also the organizational level. If you come from the data protection field, you already know that approach. It's called data protection by design, where you have to implement the legal requirements into the organizational and technological design. But it's not so data protection specific. Actually, it's quite ubiquitous, yeah? At least if we talk about technology regulation. And the problem there is that this requires the people who are working on these different dimensions or levels, so lawyers, informaticians, business economics, etc., that they have to find a common language and adapt their concepts, goals, methods, etc., so that they finally really come to a certain final goal, for example, sharing data in a legal way in Europe. And then we have a third challenge, which is that very often people, at least I get the impression that people think that the value and the risk of data is static. So that you can look at the data and say, oh, data, you have this value and this risk. And this is not at all true because it's very dynamic. It's the risk and the value of data completely depend on how you use the data, so on the purpose. So you take one datum, and in one situation, it's completely valuable and not risky. And in the next situation, it gets very risky. And in the next situation, it gets even more valuable, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always changing the whole time, and which means that this regulatory, technical, and organizational structures you have to implement in order to meet the different laws have to adapt it all the time, yeah, according to the changing risk and value. And this dynamic nature makes it even more complex. So now let's start with two basic situations when data is shared. So we have a voluntary data sharing situation and a mandatory data sharing situation. And before we come to the idea of mandatory data sharing, I will briefly explain you the problem of voluntary data sharing. So normally, a data holder only shares its data voluntarily if this data holder sees a higher value in the sharing than risks and costs associated with the sharing. That's so obvious, you don't have to explain it in more detail. But here comes the problem. Because in practice, very often, the value of data, at least from the perspective of the data holder, is so vague and abstract compared especially if you talk about data-driven innovation, because then the data holder has to give the data away, and the data user takes the data, innovates, and finally someday it says, oh, now Heureka, I have it, here's the value of the data. And then, but this is later, and so before, in the moment the data holder has to share the data, this value is very abstract and vague. And on the other hand, you have, in that moment, the data is shared, so very early in this data life cycle, you have pretty specific and high compliance risks. Because you have data protection, but equally business secrets, you have IT security, and many, many other legally protected interests. And this is what the data holder and the data user have to comply with. And this makes it already difficult because you have a vague value and a very specific risk. Doesn't sound very tempting. And then it gets even worse, because even if you have a very savvy data user or data holder who know how to minimize the risk of data really to a minimum, then still currently the efforts you have to do in order to reach that minimum risk are so high that the costs explode. And everybody, and this is exactly what we see in our Urban Data Challenge, we have at least 5 experts just working, more actually, in the city, 3 experts, so many people just dealing with one simple challenge. It's just how can we get data from one mobility provider to another party and finally the analytical results to the city. And it's so complicated, we work on this since a year. Okay, so, and this is a problem, of course, because you see, in some, you have the value is lower than the risk and the costs. And in that situation, nobody shares voluntarily its data. So what can we do? Also, first thing is, of course, we have in some way really to reduce the compliance risks. And one simple way would be, okay, we get rid of trade secret protection, data protection, IT security. We don't need it. I don't think that this is the perfect way, but it would be one way. But if you say, no, we have our European values, so we have privacy and we have business secrets, then we have to find a way, how can we use the data while nevertheless respecting these values? Yeah? And there is a way. So the next thing, but it's difficult to find it and to get through. So the next thing what we do is, if we know the way, we have to organize it in a way that it starts scaling. Because if you hire a lawyer each time again, the lawyer gets rich, but the data holder and the data user, they get poor. And so it's not working. So we have to reduce the costs in some way. It's really a very tricky business problem, in my opinion. And then the third thing what we can do, of course, is to specify and increase the value. Okay, now let's just take this value question and let's delve a little bit, and you have to increase the value to such an extent that this is finally higher than the risk and the cost. That's clear. Okay, now let's take just the value question in voluntary data sharing situations and look at this a little bit closer. And there you can see that it's actually not just the value of data, but you have 2 perspectives. The value of the data from the perspective of the data user, that's already one thing which must be solved, one piece of the riddle. And even the problem is, this is often unanswered, yeah? Because, for example, in innovation processes, it takes some time, but also if the administration, public authorities use data in order to make some public tasks more efficient, how do you translate such a value into a, for example, financial value, which might be the more important value for the data holder? So big question mark. And even though, if you know that, you have to find a solution how to let participate the data holder in the value creation of the data user. Yeah? 2 steps you have to make. And normally, the discussion immediately intuitively says, because we all come from the idea of free markets, of course, hey, the market price, that's the solution. We just say the data are traded as a normal economic asset, good, and then there will be a objective market price, and the only thing what the data user has to do is to pay the market price. It's intuitively super clear. It's a liberal idea, and I also believe in the power of markets, but we have one problem here, because do we have a market price? And actually, so far, only in niches. The big data which is available, we don't have market prices. And why is this so? Because we don't have markets. Because what are markets? For a market, you need many transactions over the same good, here data, and trade it between many different actors over a certain period of time. And then over time, then an objective market price appears because of the need and the offer, and finally it's stabilized and you get the objective market price. And our problem is we don't have such a market because we don't have the transactions, because the compliance risks are so high that it's just not there. Maybe it comes someday when we find a way how to minimize the compliance risks that these data are really traded, but until then we don't have these prices. And that's really interesting to see, because a market where this really works well so far already is the marketing, the trade with email addresses. But it's ironic because there, it's a gray market in some way, and it only works because these players don't care so much about their legal compliance. So it's interesting just to observe. So what to do until we don't have a market and don't have an objective market price? What we should do is, from the perspective of the data user, okay, we have to give an other offer. And this could be, of course, a service for free, for example, works very well in some sections, or a quid pro quo sharing deal. Yeah, so you give me your data, I give you my data, or just moral satisfaction also works, but always only in niches. And it might work, but I don't see it really in a very big, broad scale. And this is what at least the European Union and also the Deutsche Bundesregierung actually wants with the European data strategies, right? So we really want to have data shared at a broad scale. So what to do more? And here I would like to stop for a moment and ask, why do we have actually to let the data holder participate in the value creation? And this is a provocative question, I know, but the answer, I've already shown the answer. Why do I come to this conclusion? And I came to the conclusion the very first time when I read the Data Act. Because in the Data Act, at least in the draft version, you still have, you say, the data holder in sum, and very, very superficially, only has to share the data, and data protection, business secrets must protect it, and even the negative interest, for example, that the data user is not allowed to use the data for products which compete with the products of the data holders. So, I mean, if you take all these already legally protected interests and you respect them, then I dare to ask, why should the data holder, beyond that, participate in the value creation of the data user? Why do we just don't say, hey, we just take that, as here you have, for the data holder there is no risk anymore, because it's completely diminished, no trade secret protection issue, etc. He has to bear no costs, because this is all bared by the data user. And then the question is, okay, why does the data holder want even more? Why don't we just say, this remaining information is a common good? It's a little bit provocative. But if you think it through, why not? And now let's come to the next consequentially steps. Okay, if this is really a common good, because I think there is no interest anymore in it, I mean, they are not sharing the data anyway, because there is no market. So then let's open it up by law, because people don't do it voluntarily. And what to do? Because the problem is, even if the data holder has no legal right, it has a factual control. And to break up that factual control, you need a law. Yeah, if you don't trust in brute force, for example. So we need mandatory data sharing laws in order to break factual control, so long as all these legally protected interests are protected, because then, so far, then this data is a common good. Now let's come to the conclusion, because you see, I say, actually, I think it's not so far away to say, why not a universal data sharing law? Okay, it's a big political issue, and we could start a little bit smaller. And the smaller version is that you say, okay, so let's say at least for data generated through the use of public infrastructures, for example, public roads, which are used by mobility providers, or data which are generated by the use of public money in research projects. There you could immediately step in and say, okay, but at least this data should be a common good as long as data protection and trade secret protection is protected. So I don't see it. And if you then go even further and say, hey, and by the way, it's just for the public authorities so that they can fulfill their public tasks, I don't see any reason anymore why we should restrict that. And there, I really think if you look at the Data Act and Article 15 and how closely this was actually framed, I don't see it. Why just don't we open it up if you come from this, at least, line of argumentations? And this is it actually. I could now say more about legislative competence questions, but we couldn't skip that to the drink session.